The Washington Post recently calculated that in one 7-day span in September, Gabby Petito's name was mentioned over 800 times on the 3 major cable news networks. The round-the-clock media coverage surrounding Gabby's disappearance and death has ignited this important conversation about the lack of attention when the victim or person missing is of color. Even Gabby's father, as I mentioned, Joe Petito, urged the press to cover other stories and wondered why they weren't.
I want to ask everyone to help all of the people that are missing and need help. And like I said before, it's on all of you, everyone that's in this room, to do that. And if you don't do that for other people that are missing, that's a shame. Because it's not just Gabby that deserves that. So look to yourselves on why not that's not being done.
Joining us now to help us understand the why is NPR's media correspondent David Folkenflik and Dr. Danielle Slakoff, an assistant professor at Sacramento State University who co-authored a study on what is called missing white woman syndrome. Thank you both for joining us today. Dr. Slakoff, I'll start with you. I've had to do this soul searching as well, been in way too many newsrooms. When Gwen Ifill said missing white woman syndrome, and my dear friend Joanne Reed repeated that recently on MSNBC, she was attacked instantly by some pretending as if we haven't been having this conversation. And we know we have. How do you process this at this point?
Yeah, it's interesting that we have seen so much discussion around the missing white woman syndrome this year because it is not a new concept. As you mentioned, Gwen Ifill coined this term in 2004, but there is a long history of these types of narratives.
David, when you saw Gabby Petito's father turn and point at the media, it was like a spear through our souls. I don't care if you're local or national, if you don't see the damage that's done by this imbalance, then you don't want to see it. How do you explain why it keeps happening, David?
I think that if you look on the local level, oftentimes the sin has been to pathologize people of color, to treat them only as the victims of crimes. And yet when we question when things are elevated to national attention and scrutiny and focus and hyper focus, they're almost erased from the picture. In this case, Gabby Petito, there was a narrative, right? You had a young woman at the early outset of her life, promise ahead of her, years of life, decades of life ahead of her, and you had uncertainty in that we didn't know how her story would end. She was missing. She had not been killed yet. So you have suspense, which if we put aside the terrible tragedy of her loss, which should not be done, nonetheless means that as a story, it is going to hook a viewer and a reader's interest. And then you add another element. She chronicled what she was doing on social media. And so there were photographs, videos, some of which we just saw on screen just now, that allowed us to see her in the moment and to hear her in her own words, something that journalists are desperate to do to capture and reflect the nature and texture of a person's life. All of that says, well, why does this story work? It works. But let's not think too hard about this. This was a young, white, blonde woman who looked like, to many media executives, the girls next door. And we often have to interrogate and ask ourselves, next door to whom?
Yeah.
Whose younger sister does this look like? Whose best friend does this look like? Whose niece does this look like? Well, it looks like that for a certain section of Americans that media executives and advertisers tend to pitch toward, but that leaves out so many others.
You just said next door to whom. That is actually the line that I wrote in this novel, this fictitious character, because I lived it in the newsroom where I never liked the moniker girl next door. Because I'm like, well, next door to who? Because depending on where you live, that determines what that girl next door looks like. Dr. Slakoff, can you speak to that pack mentality that once one news organization sees someone covering it, then we all fall in line? Can you speak to that and the impact it has on coverage?
I think this case was an example of what this looks like. We saw tons of traditional and social media attention, and it started to essentially feed off of each other. And there is some research that points to that when the major media starts to cover a case, it basically makes it so that other media start to as well. And I think that you saw it with the ballooning of coverage here. You really saw that play out in Gabby's case.
For people who don't understand, if this continues, David, what harm does this, the larger harm does this cause?
There's a terrible cost, I think, to suggesting to Americans that broad swaths of people are not worthy of our attention, that their tragedies and struggles and aspirations are not equally of value to those who are so often depicted as the heroes and heroines of the stories that are told through the media. The media uses attention to justify continued attention. You know, Gabby Petito was documenting this on social media, but very few people were following her, a little over 1,000 when she was actually doing it, which is actually not bad for Instagram. But I'm saying, you know, it's hardly a dominant media influencer before her body was found. But while the public search for her was becoming a national story, she had gotten up to 1.1 million followers. People pointed to that to justify the coverage. The New York Times pointed to a circle of reporters surrounding her parents' home in Florida to justify why its reporters were there doing exactly the same thing.
Dr. Slakoff, when people say, well, there's only 30 minutes in a newscast, maybe an hour, depending on if it's a magazine show, that obviously the news can't be 30 minutes of here are all the missing people around the world, around the country, I should say. How do you get it right then?
You know, I am maybe naive in this, but I am hopeful that this conversation that we're having right now, Tamron, and the others like it are going to lead to changes. I think that newsrooms can commit to more equitable coverage, and that the conversation we're having right now is a huge part of that, letting people know that we see the inequitable coverage and that it is a problem.
Thank you both for speaking out and joining the show. I appreciate you both joining me today.
Thank you.